Welcome to History Through Fiction, the podcast. I'm your host, Colin Mustful, and today I am so excited to be joined once again by Jillian Forsberg, author of The Rhino Keeper and the forthcoming The Porcelain Menagerie. Today we're talking with Jillian about the release of the audiobook for The Rhino Keeper. Jillian, hi.
Hi, Colin. How are you?
I'm fantastic. Really excited that we had so much success, so many people loved the Rhino Keeper that you and I decided let's do an audiobook. So for those who maybe haven't read the novel, can you just give us a quick synopsis of what it's about?
Sure. So, The Rhino Keeper is based on the true story of Clara, the Indian rhino, who was basically the first animal celebrity. And she toured Europe for 18 years with her Dutch ship captain owner. His name was Douwemout van der Meer. She met peasants, royals, all kinds of people, made a really big impact in the natural world and in the world of entertainment and celebrity. And The Rhino Keeper is also a dual timeline. So it also tells a story of a 21st century college student who is seeking her own path and uncovers a historical mystery while studying abroad in Holland.
You and I have both listened to the audio as we kind of proofread it. What makes it so special? Like, how does it enhance the story?
I really feel like it enhances the story because it's so immersive. I was surprised. I'll be honest. I have not listened to very many audiobooks. I'm more of a paperback girly. I like the physical feel of like a floppy book in my hands. That's what I prefer. And so listening to my own audiobook, it was astounding to me. This is so funny how good it actually was. Like, my gosh, that's such a, a tremendously dramatic moment, or how funny of this character to say that. And I'm like, I wrote that. So the inflection of the words, like the humanity behind everything, just really comes to life with this audiobook. And I think a lot of that has to do with the narrator that we chose, which was quite a process. Um, but yeah, it's so immersive and it goes so fast. Even though you're listening to someone talk for, I think, what, 11 hours or something like that, it's like I couldn't get enough of it. And it was playing all the time in my car, on my phone, when I'm getting ready in the mornings. It was a really fantastic experience for me. It was really cool.
Did it bring out anything maybe you didn't imagine yourself? Because you're the creator of the story. You researched all the history. Was there anything about the characters that was new to you in listening to the audiobook?
For sure, a lot of it was the accents. The Rhino Keeper has a very multicultural cast, especially when you're on the Dutch East Indiaman ship, the Nappenhof. And that was really incredible to me to hear all of the different accents that our narrator, Carolyn Hewitt, put into this. But the other thing was just those subtle moments between conversations with people. And sorry, you're going to hear my cat here. We have a new kitten and he's very interested in her. So he likes to scream to make sure that she knows that he loves her. So it's interesting to me to hear the conversations between the characters, to listen to the tone of their voice and how Carolyn portrayed it. And you can go through and ask a narrator to make edits or change inflection and things like that. And I didn't have any changes for her. She nailed it pretty much on the first try with everything. And I think for me that made those people, whether they were historical figures, actual real people, which there's several in the book, or people that I created from my own imagination, it made them seem so real. I loved that piece of this, was that all of a sudden my favorite character, there's no secrets here, Zubin, has a voice and he can speak and he can laugh, and it was just there's just magic in it. This is not a fantasy book, but there is magic in the words that she put forward for the Rhino Keeper.
Well, Zubin's story is very interesting because of how you created this character. So it's to go from the painting to being alive on the page to being alive in the narration. Can you just talk about that for a moment?
I found two art images. One's a painting. One is maybe like it's just black and white, so maybe it's just pen and ink of a young boy um, in rhino pens. So one of them, the boy's back is to the viewer, and he's got dark hair, and he's filling Clara's water bucket. And the other one really captured my imagination. It's a pen and ink drawing, and Clara's in the foreground, and then in the background, there's this little boy, and he again has dark hair, and he's leaning his chin on the banister looking into Clara's pen. And it didn't seem to me that this was a boy who'd seen Clara for the first time. It seemed to me like he's leaning forward, giving that gesture of, oh, there's my girl in that way. Um, and so from that, and from the fact that I knew that our ship captain from Holland could not have known how to care for a rhino, but someone from India could have, Zubin was born of those things. But I also had to be careful. The 18th century is a very interesting time for colonialism, and Zubin is basically a product of that, where a person of color is taken from their homeland and put into Europe. Now, Zubin opted to go. Dawei did give him a choice, and he said, yes, I want to go with you and Clara. But really, he uprooted his entire life to be placed into a different situation. Zubin's young, 10, 11, 12 years old. And the fact that he leaves his entire history of what he had there and basically discovers himself and what it's like to have a family, a found family in Europe with Dawei and Clara was actually really impactful for me to hear. He's kind of a fiery little character, and I think Carolyn captured him very well. For me, he's the comic relief. He's a kid, you know, he doesn't know a lot of the political or all of the strain for the finances that the Rhino Keeper himself had. All he knows is he's got to keep this rhino alive, and he gets to entertain people with her. And the only person that's keeping him safe is someone that he is not related to. So there's this found family element to the Rhino Keeper that I love. And Zubin calls Dawei out several times for basically making mistakes or doing things that are questionable, or, hey man, do you really think this is a good idea? And Dawei listens to him because essentially, you know, they do become this family unit. It's Dawei, Clara, and Zubin, and that little triangle for me was really captured perfectly in the audio. It's so endearing. And I've heard from a lot of reviewers too that Zubin is their favorite, and I'm glad to hear that because he's my favorite too.
You've talked about Carolyn a few times, and I do want to move toward a little bit of the behind the scenes process of the audiobook. But before we do, let's take a moment to talk a little more about Clara. Uh, a rhinoceros is a large African mammal, and in the book, it's seen as the behemoth of Job, this kind of very shocking, monstrous like being. They have this hard gray skin, but on your social media, you always have these baby rhinos and the mom and the rhino prancing around. And you and I went to Salina County Zoo and met a rhinoceros, and it was very playful. It had the zoomies, as you say. You make a rhino into this very affectionate, adorable, cute animal. Talk about the maybe some misconceptions that people had back then, misconceptions people have now, and what a rhino really is as far as these lovable animals.
Yeah, so there are five extant species of rhinos left. There are two African species and then three Asian species. The three Asian species, the largest is the greater one-horned or Indian rhino. Back then, they didn't call it the greater one-horned. They actually, Clara did not even have a scientific name when she went to Europe. I love that fact about her. This is something I have to write in the future, Colin. Carl Linnaeus, the father of modern biology, who named all of the species with their Latin nomenclature, he met Clara and she became the first species to be named Rhinoceros unicornis. I love that. I had to cut it. We'll talk. Maybe I'll write that about how Carl Linnaeus sees Clara for the first time and then she's entered into the biology record books. But yeah, there was this common misconception that rhinos were man-eating beasts. Well, rhinos are not man-eaters. They're not predators. They don't eat meat at all. They only eat vegetation, but they are large. They do have horns, which there's this other misconception that horns have this magical healing property to them. They don't. It's literally keratin, like your fingernails. I've touched several rhino horns. They feel like really hard hair all around, and they're kind of loose from its base. I've even shaken one before to see like, how does this connect? What does it feel like? They're rough, they're strange. It's almost like, how do I say, like a loose tooth on a kid. So they're not magic. They don't cure any fevers, and people have this charging rhino in their brains, and that existed back in the 18th century too, where Pliny the Elder's all of his teachings from this is 2,000 years ago, all of these people who learned what rhinos were learned from someone who'd never seen one. So you have this textbook that basically says elephants and rhinos are enemies of each other. They will fight each other to the death, and then the rhino will eat the elephant. No, not at all. But it's interesting to think about that, because if that's what you learned in school, then that was it. That was your core truth. So when Clara came about, there was this one record of her that really struck me. It said that at the end of the visit, the keeper of the rhino went back up to her, and the rhino affectionately licked his face like a dog. So cute. And as you met KJ, the rhino, you definitely know that that would have been possible. He was really into us. He was happy to see us. He wanted to show off. They are more like dogs and horses combined than they are a man-eating beast. They're probably the closest living thing that looks like a dinosaur, though, with their strange cobbled skin and their armor plates and all of that. But that's really just to protect them from predators. And if you think about where rhinos live, they live in areas with lions and tigers. So those things I think have been hopefully taken back from the Rhino Keeper as people can learn about this animal. And I found that too. Like, people are like, rhinos are not very sexy. Why are you writing a book about rhinos? I'm like, go meet one. Go see a baby rhino have the zoomies. Go hear their little peeping voices, and you will say, oh my gosh, a rhino is not what I thought it was. So it's also about educating the common public of what are these animals alike, and how are they similar to us. They know their names, they come when they're called, as you saw. And they're remarkable. They have so much personality in such a large body. It's not really a surprise. But I think that's something that I really wanted to portray was Clara, especially with the documents that I do have of her being affectionate toward her keepers. She was a good girl, she wasn't this crazy animal who would stampede and rage. She really liked her keepers, and she was bonded with them. And I think the audiobook helps you see that. Although there are no recorded rhino peepings, there are recorded rhino peepings. That's the noise that they make. You can go hear them online. It's very cute.
Well, let's talk about making this into an audiobook. You talked about Carolyn Hewitt, the narrator. How did you get introduced to Carolyn, and then how did you ultimately end up choosing her to be the narrator?
This was an interesting process. So when you and I first talked about how we were going to go forward with this, I had a friend who recommended Carolyn to me. Her name is Sid Young. And Sid listens to a ton of audiobooks. And I asked her, because she'd read The Rhino Keeper early on, hey, if you were going to cast a narrator for this, who would you cast? And she said Carolyn Hewitt. And there was not even a doubt. Like, that was the only person that she recommended to me. And so I went to Carolyn's website and I listened to some of her recordings, and they were so emotion packed. That's the thing that I wanted to make sure that she could capture within this, because it is an emotional book in several spots. But I think we wanted to make sure that we had all of our options laid out. And I think it was you who suggested that we put up a little audition form on ACX. Yeah. And you're like, we should get auditions for this. And how many did we get? Like 65?
Yeah, it was over 60, and it only took a few days.
That was wild, wasn't it? Yeah. The funny part is I listened to every single one of them, and by the end of it, my 9-year-old daughter, she could literally say every single word along with the it was so cute. She's like, word for word. I don't like this one, mom. It's just so cute. I've never had anything like that process. Have you ever seen anything like that, Colin, where you had to go through so many auditions like that?
No, I mean, I knew we would get some interest, but it just blew up so quickly, and I had to I had to pause the auditions because we couldn't keep up.
Yeah. I think it's funny though that even after all of those auditions, Carolyn didn't audition because she had COVID or she was sick. And she didn't want to put her voice out without it being 100%. And I really took a gamble, didn't I? I said, Colin, my heart is telling me to go with our initial person that Sid recommended, and that I loved the emotion behind everything that she did. And I think that we made a really good call, not just for the artistry that she put forward, but for the tone of the book itself. But that was tough because the Rhino Keeper is a dual timeline. So we had to have a pretty serious conversation about if we have two different actors, because one is, it's all third person, but one is a male's perspective and the other is a female's perspective. But I think for me, because it's not written from Clara's perspective, and that's really truly the overarching main character here is Clara in that old timeline. Um, it was interesting to have Carolyn read that, and then I heard the male auditions, and I said they don't quite capture the emotion of Clara. When they talk about Clara, they didn't have the sweetness that I wanted to come through, and Carolyn nailed that, quite frankly. Plus her foreign language experience, she speaks French and German, was very helpful because there are a lot of different foreign settings in here that she was able to nail the accents for as well.
Yeah, I can't imagine how difficult that would be as from an acting perspective to try and convey all the different types of people that are in this novel from the east to the west and different ages, different genders, all sorts.
I think one of the funnest things that I did was put together a character guide for her. And I had like all of these, I had photos of people that had inspired the characters. And I gave like a 2 sentence description of them. And like, this is the kind of humor that they have. This is how I imagine their voice. Here's a Hollywood actor or a friend of mine that looks like this person. So you know, like who they are and what they look like in my mind. And she loved that. It was really fun for me too, because I had to like really go through the novel itself again and say, okay, what characters are just a small bit part that I need to make sure that she nails. And a few of them I had described in the book, like Johann Candler, as having this kind of high pitched, wispy voice. So things like that were really fun. And then there were other people who I'm like, oh, I'm so sorry, this person's Chinese. You need to redo that part. So there were all kinds of little tiny things, little nuances, because it's basically a road trip book where you traipse Europe, where everyone had a different accent local to where they were going. And you're right, I can't imagine very many voice actors being able to nail it, especially first try like she did. That was pretty remarkable to hear.
I wonder if you can give us a little bit more into what you're learning about the process. And I want to bring in the experience of your father because he's
Mm.
been through the experience of creating an audiobook and he decided to go with a cast of narrators. So tell me about some of the maybe expenses and some of the choices and some of the pitfalls and the different directions you can go with an audiobook.
So my dad, he writes young adult sports fiction, and his first book, Maggie Vaults Over the Moon, was read by an incredible voice actor, Tavia Gilbert. And Tavia did every single character just like in The Rhino Keeper. But then for his second book, The Real Education of TJ Crowley, my dad's name is Grant Overstake, by the way. And if you love young adult sports books, you should definitely get those copies, whether that's audio or not. So The Real Education of TJ Crowley, though, is more than just a sports book. It's a race-based book that is based here in Wichita, Kansas in the 1960s. It is volatile and visceral and really a coming of age story, but it's got such cool background stuff. There's a gospel choir, there's music, there's helicopter noises from Vietnam. All of these things are described in the novel. And when my dad was thinking about how am I going to put this audiobook forward, the best way that he could have done it was with a full cast audio production that essentially turned into almost like listening to a play, or what I compare it to, because a lot of people know this, is like listening to War of the Worlds, where it was so real that the people who listened to that production back in, I don't know, oh my gosh, probably the 1940s or so, they thought that that was a real war that was coming. And so what he did was put the background noises of those helicopters whirring and the sirens blaring and the basketball games and all of the whistles from a track meet, they are in the novel. So he has a cast of like 19 people that read every single part. And so it's basically like listening to a movie, and it's so immersive. Now, I don't know how long it would take us to do something like that with the Rhino Keeper, but we chose the first route. And I think one of the reasons that we did was because of cost, because basically putting together a huge production like that, it's very expensive. But the other piece is that with a 6 month sea voyage, in my book, a 6 month sea voyage, visiting all these royal places, the sounds of the wagon on roads, like the noise that would actually have to be created for sound to work for that with my book would have been so difficult in my mind to do. Plus, I would have had to find someone who could record a rhino noise when a rhino is, spoiler alert, in danger. I don't ever want to do that. You know what I mean? So there's all these little things that go into choosing the right path for your audiobook. But I think some of that too is just listening to other audiobooks like my dad's and knowing, wow, this is immersive. He's been nominated for an audio award. Like his book is a big deal in the audiobook community. But listening to that, when a book is able to do that, when you can get the full production in an area that makes sense and you don't have to find a baby rhino noise, that makes a lot of sense. Plus, he was able to connect with these incredible people. Dion Graham is one of them. Tavia Gilbert came back um, and all of these incredible people put this together for him. And when you listen to it, it honestly just hits you right in the heart. But I do think that Carolyn with the Rhino Keeper was able to do that too. And she was able to do it because, like I said, the emotion that she holds just in her voice acting was powerful enough for me to move forward. I don't know, Colin, what do you think? Do you think we could have made the Rhino Keeper into like a full scale, huge production with like string music and, wagon noises? It would have been tough. It really would have been.
Well, I do think it would have been interesting to have multiple narrators. I don't know about if all the sound effects would have been necessary. Like you said, Carolyn does such a wonderful job, but there certainly is space for different narrators, especially since we have multiple timelines. But the scope of such a project is daunting, and this is
Mhm.
just the second audiobook that I've produced. It's the first one that you've worked on, so this is kind of where we started, and I'm really happy with how it turned out.
You listen to a lot of audiobooks, right?
Yeah.
When you were listening to your book and the Rhino Keeper, how did you feel? Because, History Through Fiction is a pretty small press, but how do you feel they compare to other audiobooks that you listen to?
Oh, they're every bit as good as anything on. I mean, your book is on Audible, and it's right up there with any book on Audible. And a part of that is because for mine and for yours, we have professional narrators, professional actors, and they're good at what they do, and they have production teams helping them. And that's one of the reasons you and I went with ACX, which publishes to Audible, is they handle all that behind the scenes stuff. They don't give us a file that we have to then do the audio mixing and design and all that kind of stuff. They do, we pay per finished hour, and they take care of all that so that it sounds good. All we have to do is do the proof reading, which is really interesting for my book because the actor I hired, Scott Fleming, is from Scotland, and
Oh,
he does a really good job. My book takes place in Minnesota. It has Ojibwe and Dakota Native American characters. He does a really good job with the Ojibwe language. What he doesn't do a good job with is the place names, and that's something I don't realize as a Minnesotan, how everything is named, has a unique sound to it. The city names, the lakes, the rivers. And so he would often mispronounce things that I just take for granted. And even now, there's still some mispronunciations in the audiobook, but for the most part, he does a really, really good job. So I don't know if you noticed that with yours. Obviously, yours doesn't take place in Kansas where you live, but maybe there are a few things that you have specialized knowledge for that Carolyn didn't, and you had to say, "Hey,
mhm.
Carolyn, this is actually this kind of a thing."
There were a few things like that, and she did send me a list of all of the words that she was unsure of. And then she looked up the pronunciation of the foreign words just to make sure. And, I've heard a couple people say, oh, she still pronounced this incorrectly. But the reality is that there are so many different ways to pronounce things in different dialects and different accents from where people are from, that for me, it's like, is it really interrupting the narrative of the story and the heart of the story if she mispronounces one or two words? The answer is no, it's not. But that's actually something funny that you brought up, because of all the 65 auditions that we got, Colin, I don't know if more than two of them pronounced the main character's name the same way. We had to have a really serious discussion of how to pronounce Douwe Vandermeer. And it's really funny to me because I've said this a couple times in like book clubs and everything. It's like the worst main character name you could possibly come up with. And I didn't come up with it. This is a real historical figure, and his name, I'm going to spell it for our listeners, is Douwemout. And the Clara expert in the world that I worked with most closely, she's British. Her name is Glynis Ridley. She says his name, Dow. I say do. My grandma says Dewey. But the problem with using do or Dow in an audiobook is that it's too close to other names. And so Carolyn, she literally scoured the internet for how to say it. What's the best way to say this so that people know that it's his name? How can she do it in a way that makes sense for the original pronunciation back in 1705 when he was born? The answer is we can't go back and like ask him, but she came up with Dawe, and that makes sense to me in several ways. But it's interesting because after listening to her talk about it and being immersed in it for 11 hours, I went from saying do to Dawe as well. It's very interesting to me how your brain can change when you hear something in your head for so long. But it was funny to listen to all 65 narrators say his name in a different way. Bless him. Bless me. I don't know. I can't go back and ask the man. I wish I could, but that's fine.
I did an interview with Chad Tower Nicky, who's the author of Notes from a Deserter that we're publishing. And his main character is William Henry Howe, Howe. And during our interview, he's constantly saying how. And it was very confusing because he would say how, How, and then Howe in the same sentence. And it was very difficult to delineate between the two.
Yeah, that's why you can't say do, because are you talking about dew on the grass or do you want to go to the
Yeah.
mall? Like, you can't do it, especially if you're just listening. It's cute too because I think a lot of the readers who physically read it are like, well, that's not how I said it. And I'm like, that's fine. Yeah. Maybe that's why there wasn't a novel written about him before and Clara before, because his name is so difficult that all the authors were like, yeah, I'm going to skip it.
Well, speaking of his name, we only have one sketch, one little image of him, and he's just this pudgy little guy that's but then on Instagram you posted him alongside an image of Eddie Redmayne.
Oh, yeah.
So tell me who the man you see in your head versus who you think he may have actually been.
Well, so there is like, okay, in all the paintings of Clara, there are a lot of people that are around her, but if you really analyze them, there is no rhyme or reason to who those people are, or if there's repeated people, you can't really tell. So the one image that we have of Dawe is black and white. It's just like a little portrait, little frame, right? And he's just this little dude just sitting there. And I'm like, no, this is a 35-year-old ship captain. He's been on a boat since he was 15. This guy is probably like, lean and muscly and has auburn hair and freckles. And I said, oh, wait, hold on. He's a mixture of Eddie Redmayne from Les Miserables, which is around the same time period, and Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. And that is him. That is Dawe. If you would like to see him in your brain, please go to my blog. I just wrote like a spoiler series about this. That's who he is to me. So if we're casting a movie, Colin, I don't know, we're just gonna have to make that connection, okay? Because Eddie would love that, right? Can't you see just Eddie? I can see it in my mind. He's dressed in 18th century breeches and an overcoat, and he is just petting the hide of a rhino. Perfect. Worldwide search for Zubin, though, right?
Hmm. That would be fun.
It would be.
Well, before we leave here, let's talk briefly about your forthcoming novel, The Porcelain Menagerie. You
Yeah.
mentioned Johann Candler, who's in The Rhino Keeper, who is a protagonist essentially of The Porcelain Menagerie. So tell us about this novel and what readers can expect.
Oh, it's a companion. And I'm so excited about it. And I've had a lot of people who said, I feel like the porcelain part of the Rhino Keeper was too short. And I said, perfect, because now you get, 90,000 more words of Johann Candler. So when I was writing the Rhino Keeper, I came across all of these really interesting historical figures, but the one that stood out to me the most was the least famous of all of them, and that was Johann Candler. He was a porcelain maker in the early 18th century. I love this about him and Douwe. Douwe was born in 1705, died in 1775. Johann was born in 1706 and died in 1775. They were literally like they shared the same timeline. And when I realized that, and I realized what Johann's life was actually like as an artist, trying to make it, but also basically being held captive by an 18th century king that is not the most famous king. His name was Augustus the Strong. He was the king of Poland and the elector of Saxony in Germany. He chained porcelain makers to the floor of his castle until they could create white gold for him in the manner that he saw fit. He was such a complicated ruler. He had great wealth, he had great artistic eye, he was a collector, but he was a womanizer. He locked his wife in a tower on the river and never saw her again. He did all kinds of questionable things. And when I delved deeper into Johann's story, I realized this is someone who dedicated his life to art. And his biggest accomplishment was making life-size animals out of porcelain, which is absolutely remarkable because most porcelain that's larger than like a human head explodes in the kilns. So the fact that this man had no background in porcelain making, he was a stone carver for a Benjamin Tomei, who was basically like under the king's care as well. He went into this porcelain factory with no knowledge, and the first thing that he makes is a life-size eagle with its wings outstretched. He must have been touched by the hand of God to be able to make these kinds of things. They lasted through wars and centuries. They're in museums. They are priceless. And he formed basically what became Meissen porcelain. This story has absolutely captivated me. And then I discovered that the king's most beloved mistress was a woman named Fatima. And Fatima was taken from the Ottoman Turks when she was basically either a baby or a child. And when I was doing research about her, one thing just absolutely it just hit my heart. The historian writing a book about Augustus Strong said this about Fatima. In a sense, he said anything that could be written about Fatima could be true because we know so little about her. But the thing that we do know was she had two bastard children with the king, and she was left an 8,000 thaler allowance in his will, and no other woman was left an allowance in his will. So this story intertwines Fatima's story with the King Augustus and Johann's story with making this porcelain menagerie under such great pressure to prove himself, to create a legacy, and also to harbor his own deep, dark secrets. I'm so excited about this book, Colin, especially because there's like little cameo at the very end too. Ooh, I had so much fun writing it, and I think it's going to be extremely impactful. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't wait either to share it with readers. One thing I love about doing the audiobook now for the Rhino Keeper is it's introducing what was already a popular book to even a wider audience. So I think that's great that more readers are going to be a part of Clara and her story. And then the Porcelain Menagerie is going to even expand that even further.
Yeah, it was interesting to me when I went back to the Rhino Keeper to make edits. I think one of the things you said was, "Does this character during this porcelain part need a name?" And I said, "He does because he's in my second book." And um, I don't like naming really minor characters, but the fact that I got to name a character in the Rhino Keeper who plays a huge pivotal role, his name is How and Johann Candler and Fatima and the animals under their care. I cannot wait for people to meet.
Well, Jillian, congratulations on the Rhino Keeper, on the audiobook for the Rhino Keeper, on your forthcoming The Porcelain Menagerie. Thank you so much for talking with me. It's always such a pleasure to do that. And thank you so much for being a part of my team, for being a part of our team. You are brilliant, amazing. So I can't thank you enough.
Yay! I'm also glad we're friends, Colin.